Ferrari's title bid has started in a very disappointing way after it was easily beaten by Red Bull and its lead car suffered the all-too-familiar fate of retiring because of an engine problem. New team boss Fred Vasseur said after the season opener in Bahrain that he needed to stick to what he had said in the build-up, that Ferrari could not win or lose the championship at the first race. We respect the pragmatism and statistically Fred's right. It's 31 points behind Red Bull with hundreds still to play for. That's simple maths even we can do. And on a more serious note, it would be wrong to write off Ferrari's hopes completely after just one bad race. But it clearly has a big task ahead to catch and beat Red Bull, and its troubled start to the new season didn't even include a carryover of some of the positives it could take when things went wrong last year. Add in the immediate return of a big 2022 weakness, which was meant to be resolved, and things look even worse. There was a bad omen for Leclerc and Ferrari even before the Bahrain GP. His power unit needed a new energy store and control electronics after qualifying. This means there was a concern in the battery pack that Ferrari needed to check properly. Drivers are only allowed 2 of these components a season, so Leclerc's already on the brink of a grid penalty there. Then came the sight of Leclerc slowing to a stop in the race with some kind of problem in the internal combustion engine. In the context of reliability problems being the Ferrari priority over the winter, to fall at the first hurdle is a massive concern. Vasseur said there had been zero indication of such a problem in dyno testing or during pre-season running, where the 3 Ferrari-powered teams completed more than 6,000 kilometers between them. Ferrari didn't have an immediate answer for either the battery or engine problems, but an obvious conclusion we can draw is that this is a frustratingly familiar feeling. Unfortunately, our reporters are pretty used to having to talk to Leclerc about Ferrari's setbacks after last year, as poor reliability and other factors doomed his title bid. In Spain last year, when Ferrari had the first engine failure that dented Leclerc's championship ambitions, he tried valiantly to disguise his frustration and instead galvanise his deflated team. He was still in the championship mix, the car was still really quick, and he believed there was genuinely a chance to make up for it. But his demeanour shifted as his 2022 hopes dissolved, and it feels like this year he has started in a similar fed-up manner. As he stood before our reporters in Bahrain, he looked and spoke like the Leclerc we heard from later in 2022, fed up and not that interested in finding the positives. Shrugging it off didn't look possible, and we get it, no driver should be expected to be happy in such circumstances. It must be galling to work so hard just to find out the car is simply not quick enough or even reliable enough. These early weeks of the season already look like a case of damage limitation, and now Leclerc is 25 points behind Max Verstappen, and already his championship prospects look bleak. As Leclerc suggested himself, how can you look for positives from this, especially when the usual consolation for his disappointment was missing? The sheer performance of the Ferrari last year was initially something to fall back on. It takes away some of the bitterness if a driver can be enthusiastic about looking forward to getting back in the car and fighting for more wins to claw back lost ground. But it doesn't look like Leclerc and Ferrari can really believe that right now, so let's dig into why. Vasseur looked for positives after the Bahrain Grand Prix, which wasn't the easiest task, but he certainly committed to it. He pointed to being able to match Red Bull in qualifying as one positive. He also said the fact Leclerc ran ahead of Sergio Perez and kept up with Verstappen in the first stint was encouraging. But let's scrutinise those arguments. In qualifying, Leclerc only completed one run in Q3 in order to have a fresh set of softs for the start of the race. He lapped 3/10 off pole position, and it's reasonable to concede that the gap would have been a little smaller had he made a second attempt, but it's inconceivable that he would have toppled the Red Bulls. Comparing their qualifying laps, the Ferrari was strong on the straights. That proved the team has made gains in terms of reducing the drag level of its car. But there's nothing to suggest he could have challenged for pole with that second run. To say that Ferrari therefore matched Red Bull is stretching a point, even if it isn't too far behind on single lap pace. As for race pace, even when Leclerc had the advantage of starting with fresh softs rather than the used sets the Red Bull drivers had, it was of limited value. Yes, it allowed him to jump Perez, who started on the dirty side of the track, let's not forget, but during the first stint, Leclerc's time loss to Verstappen was consistent. From laps 2 to 12, the 11 complete laps in the first stint at full racing speed, Leclerc lost an average of 0.682 seconds per lap. The time loss was quite consistent lap to lap, even though it increased a little with tyre deg at the end of the stint. This does not represent keeping up with Red Bull in the first stint, even though Leclerc kept Perez behind. But given Perez knew he would have a big tyre grip advantage in the second stint, as he would run another set of softs with Leclerc taking hards, there was little incentive for him to take risks to get past at this stage. That's why Leclerc, despite arguing the qualifying pace was close to Red Bull, was critical of the lack of race pace. He described that deficit as 1 second per lap. Leclerc was probably going too far in the other direction, but it's clear that Ferrari was losing significant time. Those losses were multiplied by the fact it had a disadvantage in terms of tyre degradation, forcing it to run 2 sets of hard compound Pirellis in the race, while Red Bull only had to use it once with the other 2 stints on softs. Vasseur called this a game killer. So Ferrari has multiple problems. While you can argue that it was almost as quick as Red Bull in qualifying trim, it wasn't matching it, and the race pace was clear-cut. Even when on level terms with Red Bull in terms of tyres, or even with the slight advantage of brand new rubber, the Ferrari was giving away half a second per lap minimum. And given how big Red Bull's pace advantage was during the race, it's fair to question how much of the full potential of the RB19 we even saw. Ferrari's struggles even allowed Aston Martin to have a pace advantage, with Fernando Alonso passing Carlos Sainz to claim the final step on the podium. Sainz admitted the team's pre-race predictions were that Alonso would beat them, so it wasn't like Ferrari went into the race expecting to chase the Red Bulls for victory. Ferrari is expected to be better suited to the Jeddah circuit that hosts the upcoming Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. But even taking into account the specific characteristics of the Bahrain track, Ferrari's performance was not good enough. A year ago, Leclerc went toe-to-toe with Verstappen at the same circuit and won the race. This time, he could only dream of being in the same fight as the world champion. What we saw in Bahrain begs the question of whether we are in for a season of total Red Bull domination even more than we saw last year. However, there is reason to believe Bahrain may turn out to be at the extreme end of that domination. As you can probably tell, we don't share Vasseur's optimism about Ferrari, mainly because it wasn't even the second fastest car in the race, so there's a lot of catching up to do. But let's just focus on whether Red Bull can be caught and what the gap actually is. Verstappen was playing down the significance of his dominance, and there is something in his reasoning. One-lap performance in Bahrain is very different in terms of the balance requirement compared to the race. The track demands you protect the rear tyres at all costs, which forces teams to take on a less than great understeery balance over one lap. But the Red Bull's great spread of downforce throughout the speed range means it's less disadvantaged than the others by that conflict of demands. At tracks where that conflict is not so great, which is pretty much all of them, then the extent of the Red Bull's advantage derived from that should lessen. The aero efficiency of last year's Red Bull made it very difficult for Ferrari to race against it, even though the Ferrari had greater peak downforce. That's why Ferrari has focused this year on improving straight line speed, even at the expense of some downforce. But without the Red Bull's aero efficiency, that matching of Red Bull's straight line speed this year has come at a greater cost in performance than could comfortably be afforded in Bahrain. It turned the Ferrari into a heavy user of its rear tyres, which is a big penalty because of the track's high tyre degradation. So Ferrari should, in theory, be closer at more conventional tracks, and it's in better shape than Mercedes, which might offer some comfort to Leclerc and Sainz. Ferrari is adamant there is nothing conceptually wrong with its car that leaves it vulnerable to being rubbish on race day. The belief is that the one-lap pace shows its true performance, and Ferrari should be able to replicate that over a stint at most tracks. Perhaps that will even be enough to get it ahead of, or at least on terms with, Aston Martin in race trim. But that would still mean being at least a quarter of a second behind Red Bull, so clearly Ferrari has to make outright performance gains. It knows that, and upgrades are already in the works. Ferrari expected to start this season a step behind Red Bull. Sainz even suggested it's just as far behind as it feared. Throw in the reliability concern and it's a grim outlook for Ferrari and maybe F1 as a whole for 2023. But if Bahrain really is an exaggeration of the pecking order, then perhaps it will all come down to how much Ferrari's car can be improved. That means bringing in-season upgrades that are a lot more effective than what we saw last year, with the added pressure that its new Fernando Alonso-led rival has an aggressive development plan for the AMR 23 over the course of this season. For the sake of the championship fight, if there is to be one at all this year, hopefully Ferrari's development step is better than the one it thought it had made on reliability over this winter. That's where Ferrari's at. If you want to hear more about Mercedes' even worse outlook for the new season that we mentioned earlier, check out this video we made covering that in detail.